Good evening. I'm Jennifer Benka, the President and Executive Director of the Academy of American Poets. We're so happy that you've joined us for the launch of our fall season, kicking off tonight with an important conversation about poetry and social change that we're pleased to present in partnership with our friends at the Eisenhower Foundation and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. For those of you who might not know much about the Academy of American Poets, we hope you'll visit our website, Poets.org, where you can learn more about our free poetry programs and publications. We're so honored to have with us such a distinguished group of poets tonight, many of whom serve on our board of chancellors. Tracy K. Smith, Nikky Finney, US Poet Laureate Joy Harjo, Natalie Diaz, and special guests Kyle Dacuyan and Ewing. To provide additional context about the conversation that the poets will be engaging in, I'm so pleased to have with us this evening Alan Curtis from the Eisenhower Foundation, who will talk more about their important work and the legacy of the Kerner Commission, which was part of the inspiration for tonight's program. Thanks, Alan, for being with us, and to all of the poets and you all. We hope we'll see you again at some of our future programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the Academy for this opportunity and to the members of tonight's distinguished panel. At Amherst College in October of 1963, President John Kennedy reflected on how, when power corrupts, poetry cleanses. A month later, President Kennedy was gone, and poetry was needed to make sense of our loss. Robert Kennedy read the Greeks for how to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of the world. Shortly thereafter, our losses multiplied with protests in Los Angeles, Detroit, Newark, Washington, and over 150 other American cities. President Lyndon Johnson formed the Kerner Commission to explain the protests. Most of the members of that commission were privileged white men who bore the imprimatur of the political establishment. Nevertheless, the Kerner Commission concluded in 1968 that the underlying cause of the protests was white racism. The commission advised that, quote, "It is time to make good the promises of American democracy for all citizens, urban and rural, white and black, Spanish surname, American Indian, and every minority group." Seeking the promises of democracy, the Eisenhower Foundation recently released its 50-year update of the Kerner Commission, titled Healing Our Divided Society. We concluded that America has made little permanent progress in reducing racial injustice, economic inequity, and poverty. In many ways, we have gone backwards. At the same time, over the last 50 years, the nation has built up considerable evidence on economic, education, criminal justice, housing, and voting rights policies that do in fact work. Yet, as we have spoken on Kerner and healing across America, we have found the public does not, for the most part, understand that we know a great deal about what works, and that policy needs to be based on evidence and science, not on dogma and supposition. We also have learned a great deal about what doesn't work. Most of all, what doesn't work includes false 1980s rhetoric on government being the problem. Now, with the pandemic having made everything disproportionately worse for people of color and impoverished Americans, we need to continue advocating for a more activist public sector that recognizes Kerner and healing priorities. It is time to seize the day, renegotiate the social contract, restructure basic power equations, and change the rules of the game. The goal is not to get back to normal. Normal has been the problem in America. We have, in fact, already reversed that 1980s false rhetoric on diminishing the role of federal government. 2020 hosted the largest expansion of federal financial activity in American history, and we are continuing in 2021. In order to seize the day, to scale up what works, and to scale down what doesn't work, we need what the Kerner Commission called new will from the American people. How can we create new public will in our divided society? That still is among the most important questions of our time. One answer is that new political will in America depends in no small part on intensified advocacy for voters' rights. And so we ask tonight how poets might frame that advocacy. More broadly, the Eisenhower Foundation is asking how the arts and the humanities can help change attitudes, change values, and change culture in America in ways that help generate the Kerner Commission's new will. Visionaries like Martin Luther King and Dolores Huerta created cultural change in the 60s, change that was amplified, visualized, and facilitated by poetry, by performing arts, by visual arts, and by institutions like museums. Such cultural change helped encourage public sector legislation, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. In turn, that legislation created more cultural change and still more legislation. Poets know that culture impacts policy, and policy impacts culture. We ask you, finally, in your own cleansing ways, to remind the American people of how long the dream has been deferred. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Perhaps that dream just sags like a heavy load. Or my friends, does it just explode?
Thank you so much, Jen and Alan, for your introductions. I am excited to be in the presence of such gifted and committed poets. And I have questions I'm eager to ask, and I know that we are eager to ask questions of one another. I thought I would start our conversation about the role that poetry plays or might play in civic dialogue and social change by asking each of you to talk just a little bit about the private role that poetry plays for you, and also whether and how that role has changed during the past 18 months of national crises and upheaval. Joy, would you like to start?
Okay, I can do that. I came to poetry because of social justice or social emergency. As a young Native woman at the University of New Mexico, majoring in art, in studio art. And I was part of the Kiva Club, which was the Native student club that had started out as a social club and quickly turned into Native Rights Central, because we realized that our communities that we were part of, certainly the university community, but the land surrounding it and the communities, and we were in life and death situations. And just like we are now, a kind of emergent national global emergency or emergencies. And I love poetry from the beginning. But as for writing poetry, I never saw anyone from my people really in my generation. I've learned since people were writing poetry all along, but I never saw anyone in my neighborhood writing poetry. And as I began working with these, in Native rights movements and met poets and listened to poets like Simon Ortiz, Leslie Silko, who is a novelist, but I knew her first as a writer of poetry, and others. And I realized, oh, okay, this is something. I took up a pen, and it became the way to make a road through the crisis that I came to learn with poetry by, being a lover of poetry and then becoming a participant, a writing, as a poet, that it is by following that path, it taught me how to listen, and to listen to what was possible in the midst of all the voices that said that we weren't even supposed to be here, or that, we deserve to, we didn't fit, we deserve to die, or it said, okay, here is a sound in the world, here is a place. And I didn't quite understand it. I still don't totally understand it, but I have learned that it's a tool. It's an incredible tool for listening and for making a place and opening up the space so that we can all hear each other.
How about you, Kyle?
Thank you for the question, Tracy, and thank you, Joy, for that opening response. I think that I came to poetry because I was finding language that I had always been waiting for. I had always been a reader growing up, but I remember my first experiences feeling really drawn into poetry. I think it can just draw us out of a position of deep aloneness into a feeling of community that we weren't aware existed. And that continues to be something really important for me in a private life as a reader. I also think poetry has pushed me to kind of challenge and question the contexts of language that we live in. We live in so much language of government and code and market and commerce, so much of it being really unjust. And I think something poetry does is compel me to slow down and ask questions of all of that speech matter that surrounds us, and kind of think about how things might be otherwise. And I think a third really important dimension of poetry for me as a reader has just been to spend slower time with what I don't understand. I think I really appreciate poetry that embraces illegibility or difficulty on some surface level, and we're all going to approach illegibility and difficulty from different contexts and experiences. But something that I really find as a reader of poems is I think that slowness kind of teaches us to find compassion with what we don't understand, to understand that there are limits of understanding. I think I'll stop there.
Oh, I'm just meditating on what Kyle just left us with. But first, I have to say thank you so much. It's really just an honor and a joy to be in conversation with all of you. And I'm very grateful that you began with that question, Tracy, because it's one I hadn't considered. And I think that it actually can really get lost in some of these conversations about what poetry does outwardly. And I think that beginning with what poetry does for us inwardly is really crucial. And I think that for me, in the past months, I've been really grateful for the quiet moments of reassurance that come from a poem, moments of calm, moments of solace, and really calling on poetry to pull me out of sorrow and hopelessness in a way that candidly, I'm not sure I've ever experienced at any other period in my life. I don't think I've ever gone to poetry for that particular thing so intensely, because all of us have come through and are continuing to journey through a time where suffering feels insurmountable and incomprehensible, and layered atop itself, folding always over itself in a way that that compounds our hurts. And so something about being able to turn inward to a conversation with a person who's not in the room with you, but who's conveying something to you through the poem, I think has been really powerful. And the other thing that Kyle also alluded to is just for me, my life as a poet has always, and Joy said this as well, my life as a poet is inseparable from my life as a community member. And, you know, as a young person, I probably could just as well have been like a cheerleader or something, but the poets got me first. And so poets themselves as the people with whom I'm in conversation every day. And I think maybe poets are just a little more comfortable talking about our misery than other types of friends that I might have, but I feel very comfortable and very grateful going to poets during this period of time to talk about that insurmountable sorrow and to kind of oscillate between giving each other the gifts we need to keep it going for another 24 hours, or sitting in it and sitting in the discomfort and allowing it to be what it is. So that's been really important for me recently.
Tracy, I'll go.
Okay.
I was laughing at what Eve, it's good to meet you, and Kyle as well. I think the other poets we've been on panels together at some point, but I have never been with you like this. So this is a good thing for me. I wanted to say that the cheerleaders could not have had me. It would not have worked, but there was a kind of cheerleading going on inside me for the human heart. I feel like I was born right in smack dab of several wars going on in the United States of America. And one of them was the Vietnam War. One of them was the Civil Rights War. One of them was, and on and on, gay rights, women's rights, the South trying to be something that it, had always been sort of pigeonholed as. So I feel like I was a very quiet girl who was looking for other, as Ms. Clifton would say, I was looking for my tribe. And when I discovered the poets of the Black arts movement, Mari Evans and Lucille Clifton and Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez and Haki Marabuti and on and on and on, who were standing and speaking truth to power in their own way, I found my tribe. And even though I was reading other kinds of poets in school, Frost and Hughes and Brooks and people like that, I found not that I ever thought I would be a poet. I started keeping notes on the time. I started being a poet of my time. I started jotting things down that I felt very profoundly. And that over time morphed poetry. And so I feel like poets, in a way, threw me several lifelines when I was growing up, and I was able to hold on and find a way to swim in those waters as I got older, understanding what it might take, the kind of dedication and the kind of vulnerability that it might take to stay there in those sacred waters.
I think that's me to come through. Gracias for having me. It's lucky to be with you all, and just the generosity of what everybody is sharing. I'm going to try to situate. Beginning with Tracy, I think it was maybe just before things shut down. You were in New Mexico at the Linsick, and you said something that just changed I felt like I was on my way to it with my own personal poetics. I was struggling a little bit with what does it mean that I'm a poet? And I've paraphrased it since. I don't know exactly what it was you said, but I know it was what you said that shifted this. Is you, and I actually can't remember if it was behind the scenes, behind stage when you said it, or if it was during the actual reading itself. And Joy, of course, is right here. But the question I came away with is like, what is the language we need to live right now? And I didn't know I needed that question but I did, and it pushed me around a corner that I think I'd been fighting to get around. And it was the question I needed to figure out, what is my practice of language, because I have a way of fighting for language with my elders for our language, which we only have a few speakers left of. So I had that fight in me, which can be very tender, but is also rough. It's really rough emotionally. But what that opened up for me was, again, a way to find the ways that poetry helps me live. Sometimes we get caught up in the way it helps us fight. I've got a fight in me. That's the easy part sometimes. But what has happened in that space since, and I feel like you're all part of this, because Eve, this came up with the Black and Indigenous conversations you and Amanda Ticine built, but where my partner Sreda and I, like, the most important poetry and language I'm making right now is beginning in my home, when I wake up and I speak to my partner. And then when I branch out and maybe call my mother, or I think of my friends, and then I bring it to my students, and then it becomes the thing that I carry to strangers. Strangers I might encounter on the street, and also the strangers I'm imagining, or whose lives I should be imagining. And so that's been like a really lucky part of my practice, because it's the way that I've learned to love myself best in that complexity, which is such a gift of poetry, is that in a lot of ways, I think poetry teaches me how to lose. Nikky, you mentioned that war, you came up in all those wars. And I feel like that's what poetry has offered me and continues to teach me, is how to lose, while I'm also learning to find those small winnings and make them bloom, or to take those and seed them again in certain ways. And that, again, it's funny to be a poet and not be able to articulate this, but I think that's what's language is the body. And that's what I'm learning, is like, how can it make my body act? How can it make certain kinds of touch happen that happen well before and well beyond and in the periphery of the page itself. So it's just lucky to be able to constellate that and find a little bit more of what I might mean among you all. So also my light went out. I have to move for a minute, so please keep going.
That was great timing, Natalie. That was really nice how you did that.
Fade to black.
It's like a dropping of the mic. Well, listening to everybody's answers and thinking about what poetry affirmed and activated for each one of you, it makes it so clear that yes, poetry is a tool for defending the validity and the vulnerability of our lives, and that is something that we do privately. That's something we do in intimate space, and it's certainly something that happens in civic spaces as well. You talked about learning to listen to what is difficult, what we don't always understand, seeking and claiming community, the limits to our ability to comprehend something and what it means to bring language to that, an antidote to sorrow, and being citizens of a nation that is perpetually at war, whether or not it will admit that or call it what it is. But I want to ask, because we're here to talk about it, how do you feel called as public poets, as educators, as institutional leaders to advocate for poetry as a tool of intervention, as a tool of dialogue? What are the strategies that you've brought to that task?
One of the things I just start so that Tracy doesn't have to call the roll. I really didn't want to be a poet, not like it's not what I wanted to be, it's that the poets that I read and the poets that I knew and the poets that I listened to, it was like how I wanted to be, I wanted to this is how I want to be in the world, and when I work with young people who feel exploited, they don't need me to tell them that they are exploited. They know, they live this. We have that conversation. We all know how we feel about something, but what they're looking for many times is, it's kind of like what Natalie was talking about. It's like this language that I wake up and it's the first thing off my lips. And then it's the first thing off to my mother, or it's the first thing in my classroom that I begin to shape into like a raft that I can get in, or a ladder that I can climb to a different portal so that I can see out into this world that is continuing to do the thing that it's doing. That's why I hope we start talking about this, this commission. One more commission. I don't need one more commission in my life. I'm sorry, I don't. But what I need is human beings who have that second portal, or that third portal, or that extra ladder, or who can put their own hands, they're not waiting for somebody else's hands, but their own hands inside their own chest and figure out how they will survive this and how will they get beyond this. And that's the thing for me as a poet that I'm looking to create, and that's what I'm looking to share with anybody.
Can I touch on you, Nikki? Is I mean, that's one, like I'm getting fired up and like I feel you in my chest, and that's really lucky. And something I'm thinking alongside you is that, when we're thinking of civic, it's like I'm less thinking of the citizen as it's defined, and I'm more thinking about who is the city, right? Like who, and like it's easy to get caught up, I think, that I'm a poet who must carry poetry. However, the more generous and sometimes the more difficult, because it's you have to displace yourself and become of, and not like, to try to lead something, but to be of what's already in motion. And I think something that's been so generous and lucky about poetry is that I'm learning how to, and maybe always will be, like learning where poetry already is, right? I know some of us have done a lot of work in detention centers and in, carceral systems. Poetry is already there.
Already
there. And I think there's something about that generosity, which to me feels, fertile and like it's the garden, right? The garden that the city sometimes tries to crush. And then I think there's also a slightly darker part that I hope I can pay attention to, which is like, Kyle, you were mentioning like law and, all of our language of law, which has poetry deeply embedded in it to kind of lull us, right down to like the Declaration of Independence. We're used to saying like, merciless Indian savages, but like the other part of that beautiful poetic, what was it, like 27 grievances against the king, and the final one was possibly the most poetic. And I jotted, this is paraphrased a bit, so I might be missing some words, but he has an excited domestic insurrection. So like excited, like, domestic insurrections, endeavored to bring the inhabitants of our frontiers, like these just beautiful, like unspooled kind of words. And then, and then of course the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare. And then they kind of tick off the list of like everybody who natives would kill, which was everybody. And so in some ways, like poetry is being used in ways that law and the Supreme Court, even right now, like to read their briefs is unbelievable. They're almost like better poets than they are anything else. And so what that does is it created a situation where Indigenous peoples could only be the enemy and could only be terrorists, yet with that same beautiful language. And so I think, just to kind of be efficient and come back to where I tapped on Nikki, was just that, what are the differences, and how can poetry help us find the differences between citizenry and the doctrines of that versus who the people are and what our relationality is that make up the city and make up those gardens. But yeah, I appreciate being able to think toward that.
Well, it's really, I want to ask you, Eve, to chime in because, we're thinking, we're asked to remember the Kerner Commission report, and your book, 1919, is thinking of another commission report that's arising out of similar issues of racial violence. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about choosing poetry. If it really was a choice, I feel like knowing that poetry is the language with which to unpack the oversights, fallacies, and inevitable erasures that emerge from a commission report, and with which it is greeted by readers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for that kind interpolation of the book. I think I'm going to answer that in a way that is still threading back with the last two things that were said, because I've been thinking about, it moves me profoundly that Nikky said, I didn't want to be a poet, but the poets were the people doing the things that I wanted to do. And I find it fascinating. Poetry, and I think this happens in academia too, and I know many of us are also in academic spaces, there's a kind of preciousness about the occupation that I find almost funny and very abstract. And I think about how, everybody from Chase Bank to Target to the police department is going to tell you that they're here for your community, right? If you go by any bank or any big box department store, any police department, they'll have a poster that informs you that they are here for you. And I think that the reason we take that as disingenuous is because it's obviously not in concert with the actions of those entities, right? And so I think poets, sometimes we can fall into a similar trap where if we're too worried about advocating for poetry as kind of an abstract entity that we see as having a priori value, and we tell ourselves and each other and the public all the time how important and necessary and critical poetry is, but we're not doing anything, that's really bad. It's really disingenuous. And so to answer your question, I think that with 1919, what I wanted to do was really pedagogical. And I grew up in Chicago. I know a lot about Chicago history, and I was fascinated with how little I had known about the Red Summer, how little I had encountered about this episode of racial violence that is largely racial violence conducted at random by white people through attacks of Black passersby on the street, which I think is a big part of why I wasn't taught so much about it, and lots of other people weren't as well. And poetry came to me right away as the tool through which to kind of weave through this report, because as Natalie said, I read this commission report and the thing was chock full of poetry to me. So many just lines that I was like, wow, these are bars, and that I wanted to be in conversation with these. My light also just went out. I have the Natalie thing, so I'll get up and dance after I'm done talking. But that I wanted to be in conversation with this language and kind of remix it, reconfigure it, retool it. And also I thought that as opposed to writing a long comprehensive nonfiction book, which I do with other things, that this would be a way to introduce people to a period of history through the lens of mourning and grief and empathy, because the book is largely asking people to really consider the lived experiences of our neighbors who are ghosts. And I thought that I could do that differently through poems than I might be able to through a nonfiction tome. So that's a little bit about it. But I think that the one thing poetry can be really good at is allowing us to reckon with violences. But we have to do that in a way that I think is honest about the fact that poets are regular people like anybody else, and we can be fascist and racist and transphobic and terrible, and our poems can be all of those things just like anybody else can. And so how are we really holding ourselves accountable through our actions and the way we invite our poems to live in the world?
So can I don't know if I'm, yeah. Thank you for that. All of this. I keep remembering listening to everyone about language and civic and land. I remember being a student, I guess one of my poetry teachers or some of my poetry teachers were elder people I was thinking about how poetry is everywhere. I like what you were saying, Natalie, that it's already there. And I remember as a student when I was I don't know that I didn't decide to be a poet. Poetry took me, I never saw myself as a poet. It took over and I just have to follow it. I don't understand it always, except that it's always teaching me in these magnificent and humble ways. But I remember going to, as a student, as part of, as a student of the Kiva Club, we would go and sit in the meetings with the coal companies that were there to illegally take over land and uproot people. I remember sitting in the meeting with the uranium companies, and what always and they knew law. They had the law on their side, so to speak, and they knew that kind of language. But what stays with me now, and I think gave footprints for my poetry in a way, were the testimonies of the people. They spoke poetry, because in English was this way too, and it started shifting as metaphor was primary, until we got into text language, and then it gets stripped away. But they gave testimony about the place, about the people, about the relationships. It's all about relationships, about the relationship of this place and what it means and what the destruction could mean. And I could still hear their voices. And there was a lot of respect and metaphor, beauty, and hard truth about what was going on. And I guess what stayed with me and what I'm still trying to learn, because there's still trying to learn as a poet, is that when they spoke, it was their voices stood above the ugliness. And a lot of it happened anyway. And that's another question I always have, about our words and the usefulness, and is, we all have that. But it's interesting, it was in their speaking, they spoke past, present, and future all at once. And that's something that it still resonates with me all these years later. I don't know how many years ago that was, 50 years ago. It stays, those voices and the power of the poetry in those voices in those communities.
When you mention past, present, and future, I want to try and think about our relationship to the past. Kyle, I'm saying this because last year you, in one of your statements as director of the Poetry Project, you said 2020 seems in some ways to me a metonym for this particular 4-year period we also find ourselves with some uncertain proximity toward. And the frank truth is that this 4-year period has been a metonym for the several centuries of this fictional nation and its violences, which have been so constant that they have performed on many of its residents a shocking inurement, but not upon the poets. And so thinking about, yes, poetry exists in many different forms, contexts, and for many different, motives. But there is something poets do or can choose to do with poetry that is corrective to the forgetting that some of those other uses of language are urging us to surrender to. I want to know, Kyle, can you get back to the earlier question by way of this brilliant quote of yours? What are you thinking the charge right now is for you and the community that you feel that you serve?
Thank you. Thank you for that reading. I think I'm remembering that reflection coming out of really looking around the place and the land where the Poetry Project at St. Mark's is situated. So that's the organization where I feel very grateful to do work from. The Poetry Project presents readings out of St. Mark's Church in the Bowery, which is the oldest site of continuous institutional religious worship on the island of Manhattan. And so what that means is that it's a very originary site of genocide of indigenous people. It's a site that was whose earliest congregants were slave owners, and I continue to be thinking about what does it mean for us to be presenting artistic work from this space? What does it mean for us to, I think the central question of our work is asking how poetry and community mutually form one another. And a primary way we do that is through readings. And it just feels like a continuous, complex question to consider gathering in a place that holds those lineages of violence. I don't necessarily know that poetry offers a curative or even a reparation to that. I do think that what poetry can do is bring us into self-criticality and bring us into an imagination of otherwise, and bring us into a position and an energy of struggle and advocacy. We organize weekly readings at the Poetry Project, and that has mostly continued even through the pandemic. And something I notice is just the way people are almost atomically rearranged after a shared listening experience of just being in time together around poems. And that crosses geography, that crosses ability. I just think there's something deeply reconstituting about being in time around surprising, unconventional, critical, questioning, searching language. And I think what it can do is it can open us in new and unexpected and urgent ways.
Thank you. I think about the configuration of original communities and transgressions that you enumerated at the beginning of your remarks, and I think about the formation of new communities, the calibrating of our sense of who we are and what we want to participate in, that many of us are doing. And I also think about the border transgressing nature of the work that each of you does in different ways, right? Whether you're working across disciplines, across art forms, across languages, across geographies. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about the borders that you live with, the borders that you seek to defy or eradicate in your work, and the communities of people that you're doing that with, or that you seek to do that with. And I know it's not just poets. I know that when we say poem and poetry, there's someone who's saying visual art, there's someone who's saying something else, and we speak those other languages too. I'd love to hear your thoughts about
I can start by saying I'll do anything I can get away with. I write, in terms of genre, I write poems and I write comic books and I write nonfiction work and fiction and all of the things. And I think it's because what all of us have returned to throughout this conversation so far is a kind of urgency that necessitates action and, instrumental action. And I wrote down this quote from Natalie, or from Tracy via Natalie, of what is the language that we need to live right now. And we could expand that to say, what are the partnerships that we need to live right now? What are the forms of dialogue that we need to live right now, that we need for survivance, that we need for thriving? And I'm not really interested in the sort of random constraint that has to take, that has to look a certain way. And so what I'm always hoping for, my dear friend and frequent collaborator, Nate Marshall, once told me, the greatest thing a poem or a poet can give is permission. And so what I hope to do is, through my sort of ridiculous, seemingly, perhaps externally seemingly random, doing lots of different things, is to give other poets permission and give other people permission to feel like we can call upon the many gifts that are available to us to do the work that is urgent. It's really urgent. And I feel not very innovative in doing that. I feel like I'm copying lots of ancestors who have been doing that, right? Many of whom are here in this conversation. So I'm very grateful to be following in those footsteps.
I engaged this question as a poet and administrator at the same time. And I'm an administrator of an institution that I love very deeply. And at the same time, I have really fraught feelings about institutions in general, because I think so many cultural institutions perpetuate so many of the different kinds of violences from other hierarchies that we've already been talking about. And so many of our cultural institutions are enriched and sustained on sickness and climate destruction and state violence, and all that those material resources are underneath so much of the cultural apparatuses that we experience art through. I think the way I tangle with that difficulty is just asking, how might institutions be different? How might we reimagine the kinds of structures of relation and community that institutions can offer? And I think that for whatever reason, I find so many of the poets in my life, and so many poets who I'm friends with and who I admire, have some kind of parallel, like, infrastructuralist work. A lot of people are poets and curators or teachers or editors or translators. And I know that many other practitioners in other disciplines have parallel roles too, but I think there is something very particular about the dual ways that poets approach different kinds of infrastructure. And it's partly because the material that we're working with is all units of relation. Like, everything that we're engaging at the language level is asking how we might relate to one another differently. So I'd like to have faith that poets have some central part in reimagining what our communities and our cultural communities specifically can look like and manifest.
I guess I'll attempt, and it'll be clumsy. Is that I was sitting here writing down, thinking about this, and what came to me was a chord sequence. And I think, okay, so that's part of it. And then I was thinking too, the first thing that I wrote down was, well, the McGirt decision and what's going on now between, the borderlands between tribal nation, governance, state, and federal, and the intentions, which are very different between the three of them. And then thinking about too, how in the world, as you were talking, Kyle, thinking how in the world we want to start. I've been talking with Native I mean, our community members who are in education and the arts and so on. And we want to start, we're thinking of a coalition, but not a coalition. We want an arts and cultures foundation. And ultimately, we want to help start a school that would start with the younger kids. And I'm thinking, you know, I'm not an administrator, but I wind up in these positions, you know, and then how do I put all this, you know, and that's my quandary every day, every morning that Natalie is in this beautiful reverie of going from, you know, here and here and here, you know, and then I get stuck and, okay, how do I, you know, it is there and the ancestors. Then there's, I like thinking about too, where you were talking, Kyle, about, you know, here's the root, and these are the indigenous peoples here, and this is the place I stand, and here are the indigenous people, and then here are the slaves, and then here are the slave owners, and then here are these people, and this and this and this is, you know, and here we are. And so for me, I've had to I try to make them one thing. I mean, because ultimately it is the music, the poet, you know, it makes me, I've always been different. I mean, I walk a race line, I walk identity line, you know, I'm who I am. And yet I've always been at the borders. You know, I play a saxophone. What poet does that? There's no poets that do that. And I didn't start till I was almost 40, and I'm a woman. And then I write poetry when I was told, you know, I would get no money for school and graduate school because it's not useful. Everybody else is going in education. We need lawyers. We need, you know, this is what's going to help our communities. So in a way, I'm never comfortable with any of it. But I think a lot of us, if you, like you were saying, if you look at our lives, we find a way to build. I mean, it becomes an inherent part of everything I do, and in the midst of it, I keep hearing those voices or those songs. I think I guess the word that's coming up a lot for me recently is resonances. Like we were driving, my son was in the hospital, and we drove all night to get here. That's why I said I didn't sleep much, so I may be incoherent. But there are all these wind machines on one side, and the other side, I said, can you feel the resonances? And I think that what happens in all of, there's a resonance that we work towards. There's a resonance for a song, because everything is sound, everything is vibration. And for me, that, you know, it's music, it's all of it, music, community. I think it is for all of us in some way. We just talk about, you know, there's different ways we put it together. And for me, poetry is when the resonances settle into a coherent shape. And we can sit in it by ourselves, alone, or with our lover, our partner, with a whole community listening. And then, like you said, I like the idea, you know, what you were saying, Kyle, how everybody kind of, they feel closer at a reading, or they find there's a resonance that settles in. And then we find a way to go back out into the world, even as we're in the world.
I want to touch again. I feel like this is Kyle and Joy. You are kind of guiding me to ask you guys about how do we allow the largeness of the imagination, which sometimes feels like it's too big for the institution, to work in concert with the part of ourselves, Joy, that I think you were also talking about, that wants to build something together. One of the realizations and maybe heartbreaks that I've experienced over this period is in the phrase that has come to me over and over again: institutions won't save us. The institutions that I've long trusted, maybe naively, aren't going to fit the bill. I can't turn away from the work that I want to do in support of them, but there's got to be work outside of that as well. And this is where my sense of wanting the imagination to somehow be able to swell to its full largeness in some other space while another part of the work is happening. in a codified way with the limitations of, stakeholders and board members and all of the stuff that slows progress down. So if that's not so messy and unwieldy, maybe Natalie and Nikky, could you talk a little bit about how you have found the ability to build what it is that you feel you're contributing to, and what kinds of adaptive moves that's required, whether it's leaning away from the codified framework or doing something else?
This is gonna sound really crazy, but this goes back to my not wanting to be a poet, but how a poet is how I wanted to be in the world. And I was writing yesterday this story about how I wanted to. There's a dog food factory. I'm in South Carolina, and all the factories that are really horrible, of course, are away from communities per se. So you can't smell them and you can't see them and you don't know what's going on in there. But this is a dog food factory where it's very violent. It's very, it has a horrible smell if you get within 5 miles. And anyway, I was thinking as I drove past there a couple of weeks ago, and I'm not romanticizing this, I really was trying to figure out how to do it. I was thinking about the old cigar factories in Cuba and how there were readers that went into the cigar factories and read to the workers because they just work, they're manually doing the cigars all day, and they would have readers. And since 1865, they've had readers, auditors, I think they say, to go in and just read a story or read the newspaper or read a poem. And I pulled off the side of the road and I was like, this one, how could I get in there? How could I get on the PA system? How could I read some Lucille Clifton or some, and I was really trying to figure this out. And I made some phone calls and stop sign. It's not gonna happen because of how people think about workers and people think about people who work manual labor and these kinds of things. But so I wanted to tell you that story also because there was a woman who was a reader in one of those Cuban cigar factories who never published a book, never published one book, but she wrote 25 novels just to read to these cigar rollers. And I can't remember her name. I should remember it, but I thought that is how I want to be in the world. That is how I want to be the poet that I want to be. Not, as the young woman said last night, it seems, she said at the Emmys, I didn't see it, but somebody sent it to me. She said, it seems like visibility is the thing that makes you successful these days. Like how many likes you have or all that kind of stuff that this society is sort of focused on. But that is what I care about deeply. And that, nobody's gonna let me do that. I have to figure out a way to do it. But in that same realm of me taking what I love and language and poetry into a space that typically doesn't have it. 10 years ago in Kentucky, we invited people in the community to come into a bar after hours, and we set the tables in a circle and read Zora Neale Hurston. And it's like, you think nobody's gonna show up? Psh, you need extra chairs because people want the opportunity to, to see the life a little differently and to see, again, you don't have to keep telling them what they're in. You need to provide some sort of opportunity that they can see out of into a different reality. That's poetry, that's writing, that's what I want to be a part of. And that's what I keep looking for in terms of angle, in terms of, like that portal. It's a portal that I believe passionately in. And I keep running up against walls and people say, no, you can't bring that in here. They don't need you to do that. But that's because those are the people who don't understand the fullness of humanity. So I keep looking for places to make opportunities like that happen wherever I live.
Gracias for that. Again, I keep getting ready to hit the streets after all of you talk. I mean, I'm sitting in my university office. I mean, something I always say that anything I have is probably like 80% personality and maybe 20% having done something. Because I find myself in positions where I'm not actually sure how I got here, but you end up finding that you have some sort of currency. And then how do you trade that? And then you're also, how do I trade that for someone else? But also you're in that like these codified systems and structures again. And thinking this is where basketball, having played basketball most of my life, comes in, because it's not about having done, it's about doing. And very rarely do I look back and none of it matters. And it's not that I don't appreciate things or that I haven't been incredibly lucky. It's just that it's about momentum, and like this idea, I think a lot about this with my Indigenous students and my, Latinx students. There's a difference between visibility and presence. Visibility sometimes is the easy thing, because one of us suffices often, or a few of us. But presence is what's hard, because it requires all of us to continue showing up. I learned that with my language work, with my elders. Like, I had to show up for 5 years, almost every day, to show up for them, because so much was at stake for them, even as stakes that I still don't understand yet, But again, there's something I think about these relationships of loss that we carry with us in so many ways, that how do you break those? And I'm thinking, I can't remember the poem, but there's an Alice Oswald poem I've been reading with my students, but she's talking about like when a jar breaks and the water is still holding its shape. And I think about that a lot. I think because Mojaves are potters, so we carried water in these like effigy jars sometimes, with these clay pots. And I feel like that's like, even tapping backward on that border question, like I feel like that's the main border I'm at, is that there's no way that I can't be present here without something breaking. The worst part is that it's often me, with the burdens, or it's often our students. Or so how do I take that sensual skin? Because I guess that's, for me, some of what we're talking about is, and what poetry offers is the same thing with like visibility and presence, but poetry is sensual. And somewhere along the lines, we separated knowledge from this, like from what is sensual, right? So we think mind, body, ocular centrism, the eye, like mind's eye. But before that water jar breaks, there's a moment of the breaking, and then there's the moment of the water itself untethering. But somewhere in there, beyond a kind of spatial temporal existence, the water is still holding its sensual shape, a kind of skin. Like, so before it comes undone, it is still the relational self it was to what was holding it. I mean, I'm not articulating it well. It's been driving me nuts. I mean, I'm dreaming about almost having words to kind of say this. But for me, that's the gift of poetry, but it's also the burden of, I feel like, any kind of relationality I have right now with water, with teaching, with poetry itself, with fighting for my language. Like, how do I not become the breaking itself? Or if I am, I also remember there's a time before it. There was a moment before it when I was a kind of wholeness, and how to reorganize that. And a series of questions that have been just, gosh, essential to me. I've been just so lucky that poetry has brought me to other people's language. Like, from that very beginning question, Tracy, that you offered, and or you offered, whether you offered it or not, I took it, but that I have a friend named Dar Jamal who writes about climate disruption. And he has a series of questions, but I've been thinking about them a lot. And these are a little, again, like paraphrase, but he says like where are we? Where are we in the world? Like, what is the dilemma? What is it that we're struggling with or suffering for or against? And this has been essential, but it says, okay, like, what can we do to ease this or resolve it? And then the question he asks next is what has struck me, is that how will we comport ourselves if we can't figure out how to fix it? And I feel like that's what poetry is and does, is it allows us to comport ourselves somehow without knowing exactly what the answer is, and possibly without having the question. And I guess that's the imagination. Like, to me, that's what the imagination is. It's possibly not knowing the question, but understanding there's some tension of life, life from the moment a stem bursts into a branch or another part of a stem. It's a kind of violence. Like, how do we explain the urgency to want to live? So much so that sometimes we do it even if our mind tells us maybe I'm not up for this, it happens. But I guess that's where I'm wondering about the imagination, and what poetry offers me is that it's somehow carrying me or teaching me or urging me or ushering me to comport myself, even if I don't have an exact answer or ease or definition for what it is I'm living into, whether that's joy or sorrow or pain or wonder. I don't have the language, but now I'm suddenly very excited about what I might mean with you all.
It's so profound. I'm grateful to all of you for your thoughtfulness, generosity, and just the resourcefulness of your imagination and conscience. Thank you for the poems that you write and the work that you are building with your voice and all that you do. I'm going to take with me this idea that, there are portals that our presence can help facilitate, and there's something that must break that we also have to take care of, and so much more. But thank you so much. It's been such a joy.
Thank you, Tracy, for the great questions.
Gracias, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.